and just say good afternoon or good evening in UK time, and good afternoon to Bill, who's in Washington, D.C. Really grateful to Professor William LeoGrande of American University for agreeing to do this talk for us today. Bill is, well, I would think the world's, at least in the English-speaking world, leading authority on the history of US-Cuba relations. And if you look to the right on your screen, just above Bill's head on his shelf, you can see one of his latest books, Back Channel to Cuba, which is a history of US diplomacy towards Cuba since the revolution. And it's an extremely informative and well-documented book that I could highly recommend to everybody. So I just want to say thanks to you all for coming this afternoon as well. The International Institute for the Study of Cuba, based at the University of Buckingham, is a growing organization dedicated to a dispassionate understanding of the Cuban revolutionary process. We rely heavily, and in fact completely, on donations. So if you do feel generous, we would very gratefully welcome a donation towards the cost of running these seminars. This is the first of 2022, and it's an absolute pleasure and delight to welcome Bill. Bill's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&As. And he's not going to have a PowerPoint presentation. He's just going to talk to us, but you'll find Bill to be extremely entertaining and informative. Thanks, Bill.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. So Biden's Cuba policy reminds me of a scene in the film Apocalypse Now. So Colonel Kurtz, who's played by Marlon Brando, asks Captain Willard, played by Martin Sheen, why Willard has been sent to find him deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And Captain Willard said, "They told me that you had gone totally insane and that your methods were unsound." And Kurtz replies, "Are my methods unsound?" And Willard says, "I don't see any method at all, sir." So let's see if we can find the method in Biden's Cuba policy. During the 2020 campaign, candidate Joe Biden had the policy on Cuba that you would expect of someone who was the vice president in the Obama administration. He criticized Trump's policy towards Cuba, promised to return to a policy of engagement, and really attacked Trump for a policy that didn't make any sense and that hurt ordinary Cubans. And specifically during the campaign, Biden said he would re-engage with Cuba diplomatically, which Trump had essentially cut off. He would reopen the consular section of the U.S. Embassy. The United States has been out of compliance with the 1994 migration agreement that ended the rafters crisis ever since Trump came to office in 2017. We're obligated under that agreement to provide a minimum of 20,000 immigrant visas to Cubans every year. And the actual number we've been providing is on the order of about 10% of what we're obligated to do under that accord. I would point out that the Cubans have continued to uphold their end of the accord despite that. Biden promised to review the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is something that Trump imposed, citing the same very weak evidence that the intelligence community had rejected in 2015 when Obama took Cuba off the terrorism list. Biden promised to relax travel restrictions, calling Americans the best ambassadors of freedom. Trump, as you will probably recall, had abolished the people-to-people category being used by non-Cuban Americans who were traveling to Cuba, some 600,000 a year by the end of the Obama administration. And Trump had promised to restore remittances in order to improve the living standards of Cuban families. Trump cut off wire transfers of remittances just before the 2020 election in a sort of obvious play for hardline Cuban-American votes in Florida. So President Biden has come to office, and we're more than a year in now, and he has kept all of Donald Trump's policies and sanctions in place, including the basic orientation of U.S. policy as one of regime change, which is something that Obama had explicitly repudiated. So just to recap what's happened, for the first 6 months, the Biden administration did nothing while they were conducting a policy review that frankly seemed more performative than substantial. There was much meeting with and talking with various stakeholders, but there wasn't much evidence of actual policy review going on within the foreign policy bureaucracy. They created a remittances working group that was supposed to figure out how to most effectively restore remittances. But the White House seems to have taken the position that it won't allow the restoration of remittances if the Cuban government gets any of the money, which of course is impossible because banks charge fees for handling remittances, and all of the Cuban banks are owned by the government. And so you can't really have wire transfer of remittances without the Cuban government getting some sort of fee. The question really ought to be, of course, what's a reasonable fee? But that's not how they've framed it. And yet, interestingly, Biden has repeated this pledge of promising to restore remittances very, very recently in letters that are being sent out by the White House to people who write in complaining about his Cuba policy. And then finally, Biden has imposed additional sanctions on Cuba after the July 11th demonstrations. And these have been a combination of what are known as Magnitsky sanctions, named after a Russian journalist who died in custody. These are targeted at international actors who violate human rights or are corrupt. And the sanctions are that you're not allowed into the United States, and any assets you have in the United States will be frozen. The other sanction that the Biden administration has used is simply to impose blocks on any visas for certain targeted individuals without the whole assets thing. Now, these sanctions are really symbolic. They have no practical effect at all because the people named are senior government and security officials. They don't have assets in the United States. If they did, they would already be frozen by the embargo. And they're not the sort of people that are going to be seeking tourist visas to come and visit the United States. And of course, Biden has failed to restaff the embassy or reopen the consular section or resume bilateral talks on any of the issues of mutual interest on which Obama signed bilateral agreements, 23 bilateral agreements. Now, this is also a promise that Biden has reiterated very recently. I will say that the embassy staff has gradually been increased over the last year from what it was, but the consular section is still closed. Interestingly, Republican Cuban Americans in Congress recently held a press conference urging Biden to reopen the embassy. So that may actually clear the way, or reopen the consular section rather. That may actually clear the way politically for that. So the question is, why is there this extraordinary disjuncture between what Biden said he would do during the campaign and what he's actually done? And I want to explore with you two categories of factors that I think can help to explain this. To see, if you will, if there's really any method at all here. So the first, of course, domestic political factors. I'm sure you're all very much aware of these. They're the most common explanation for Biden's inaction. And of course, domestic politics has been an important factor in U.S. Cuba policy since at least the 1980s. So there's a long history of this. But secondly, I think there are also a number of foreign policy factors that have been overlooked to a certain degree, and I think are worth keeping in the mix, if you will. So first, domestic politics. First, there's what I call the fear of Florida. The Democrats lost big time in Florida in 2020. They lost a lot of ground among Cuban American voters, over 60% of whom some people think is maybe as much as 70% of whom voted for Trump. They lost 2 House seats that they thought were safe in South Florida, seats with considerably large Cuban American constituents. And of course, Democrats are worried about the Cuban American vote in 2022. They'd like to try to win back those House seats because obviously every seat counts when you've only got a margin of 3 in the House. And they've got, I think, plausible challengers for Governor DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio, both of whom up for re-election, both of whom possible presidential candidates if they can get through this midterm. And you've got now running the Florida Democratic Party a Cuban American who is not a friend of engagement with Cuba, and who in fact was the lawyer for Elian Gonzalez's Miami relatives back in 2000. So frankly, I think Florida's gone for the time being. I think it's a pipe dream to think that Democrats are going to win Florida back. I don't think they lost Florida because of Cuba policy. I think they lost Florida because Republicans were successful at branding Democrats as socialists in their domestic policy, and also because the Biden campaign didn't put any resources into Florida to speak of. But perhaps just as importantly as all of this, you have to understand the background of the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. He was Al Gore's lead attorney during the 2000 Florida recount, and he will tell you that he is still traumatized by that loss. So Florida is, for these folks, a third rail of politics, and they're just scared of their own shadow when it comes to Florida. The second domestic political factor, of course, is fear of Menendez. Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, Cuban American, is currently chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has the power to hold up all of Biden's foreign policy initiatives, including all his ambassadorial appointments and all of his State Department appointments. He's the 50th Democratic vote, so Biden needs his support on absolutely everything. And he has been known in the past to threaten unrelated legislation in order to get his way on Cuba policy. There's a rumor on the street that he threatened to withhold his vote on Build Back Better if Biden did anything positive on Cuba. Now, that's a dead issue now anyway. So there are some pretty powerful domestic political factors inhibiting Biden from doing anything positive. But there's also foreign policy factors that I think it's really important to keep in mind. First, Cuba is just not that important to the United States. I'm sorry to say, as someone who's spent most of his whole professional career studying it. White House Press Secretary Jan Psaki said right at the beginning of the administration, Cuba is not a priority. And so in that sense, it's perhaps not a surprise that they didn't do anything quickly right away on Cuba. And of course, the passage of time has probably made it even less of a priority. There's major challenges that the administration has to face in Russia, in Ukraine, with China, with Iran and the nuclear deal, not to mention COVID and climate change. And there's nobody inside the administration who is the champion for the Cuba issue, who is really pushing the administration to do something proactive as opposed to doing nothing. And, you know, I think we political scientists have pretty well established that a really major policy change requires someone in the administration to be a champion, to take the lead, to keep pushing forward, to get it on the president's agenda, to line up the internal political coalition, if you will, to make it happen. There isn't anybody in the administration like that in a senior position. If anything, the people in senior positions tend to be obstructionist when it comes to Cuba policy. Second, I think Biden has a kind of Cold War mentality. Unlike Obama, Biden's early political career was shaped by the Cold War. And I think he has a real Cold War mindset in which socialist countries in particular, including Cuba, are seen as adversaries and are seen as evil countries and opponents of the United States, and we need to contain them and, not embrace them. And that's partly because of Biden's commitment to human rights. So that's the third factor. I think that there is a kind of neo-Wilsonianism in this administration. Biden has always been a champion of human rights, which is obviously a good thing. As president, he has, as I'm sure you've seen, made human rights and democracy promotion a real cornerstone of his foreign policy, more so, I would say, than probably any U.S. president since Jimmy Carter. We just had the Summit of Democracies, of course. Now, I will say that the invitations that went out to the Summit of Democracies had a certain geopolitical smell to them. I still can't figure out why Bolivia was not invited to the Summit of Democracies, except that it's a left-wing government. It looks like now Biden will not invite Cuba, Nicaragua, or Venezuela to the Summit of the Americas, which is scheduled in July. They haven't said that formally, but a senior administration official doing a briefing for the press on the upcoming summit was specifically asked, would Cuba be invited? And the response was, well, we haven't sent out the invitations yet. The United States gets to send them because we're the host. But we look forward to the participation of all the democratic countries in the hemisphere. Well, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela just got passed over for the Summit of Democracies. So it seems pretty clear to me that they're not going to be invited to the Summit of the Americas. And so you have these echoes of Woodrow Wilson, right? Of a kind of activist or even aggressive U.S. foreign policy to make the world safe for democracy. And yet still always with this self-serving take on just who's a Democrat and who's not, because there were, as I'm sure those of you who followed it know, a lot of countries invited to the Summit of Democracies that had, we could say, questionable credentials when it comes to democracy. So the fourth foreign policy aspect here, or factor here, is that there's really no external pressure on the administration to move on the issue of Cuba. Now, yes, I know that, the United States has lost 29 votes, the last 29 votes over 30 years in the United Nations on the resolution calling upon the U.S. to lift the embargo on Cuba. We're at a point where no one ever votes with us anymore except for Israel, and Israel doesn't support the embargo. They just vote with us because we always vote with them on anti-Israel resolutions. But there's no real cost to that, frankly. The administration doesn't have to pay any real diplomatic or material cost for losing those votes every year. None of those countries actually are willing, at this point, to put their bilateral relationship with the United States at risk over Cuba. So for the countries voting against the embargo, the vote is relatively cost-free. And for the United States, losing the vote is pretty much cost-free. It's important to understand, though, to recall that one of the main reasons for Obama's opening to Cuba was pressure from Latin America and the Latin American heads of state at the 6th Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia. At that summit, Obama was advised that if Cuba wasn't invited to the next summit, no one would come. And that would be the end of the summit process. Obama was shocked by this. He'd been told by his advisors that Latin Americans didn't really care about Cuba, wouldn't make an issue of it. So he got back to Washington. He fired the director for Latin America at the National Security Council, and he began thinking about an opening to Cuba. Well, obviously, in recent years, there hasn't been any such pressure from Latin America, partly because the pink tide sort of went out. We had a number of more conservative governments elected across the hemisphere, and then everyone became preoccupied with COVID. But if you've been following Latin America, you know that in the last couple of years, there's been, the pink tide's coming back in again. There have been a number of elections in Chile and in Peru and other places. And in the upcoming elections in Brazil and Colombia, there's a real possibility that you will get more progressive governments. And the tide or the balance may shift back again. And you may have a situation where a substantial majority of Latin American countries and the most important Latin American countries are all once again pushing the United States on the issue of Cuba. That I think would help because it would be the first real external diplomatic cost that Biden has to pay for continuing Trump's policy. And fifth and final foreign policy factor here, I think, is that the protests in Cuba on July 11th, which I imagine you're all very much aware of, but thousands of people turning out in the streets spontaneously in 2 or 3 dozen towns and cities in anti-government demonstrations and in some cases riots. They were literally unprecedented in the history of the revolution. The only approximate comparison would be the so-called Malaconazo in 1994, where there was a riot on the Havana waterfront, but it was smaller than these demonstrations, and it was only in one part of the city of Havana, whereas these demonstrations in July were really nationwide. I think the demonstrations have rekindled hopes in Washington that the Cuban government will collapse under U.S. pressure, and that now is the time to keep tightening the screws. Now, I will say, having studied, as Steve said, having studied U.S.-Cuban relations for a long time, I can tell you that this pipe dream has been a feature of U.S. policy since literally 1960. And every time the Cuban government survives one strategy or another of the United States, policymakers invent a new one. So at first, of course, it was going to be the embargo, and then it was going to be the Bay of Pigs that would unseat the Cuban government. And after that, it was going to be a more comprehensive embargo. And when that didn't work, well, it was going to be the collapse of the Soviet Union was going to do it. Well, when that didn't work, it was going to be the death of Fidel Castro, because obviously the regime was only built around this one guy. And when that didn't work, it was going to be the fall of Chavez or Maduro, because Cuba couldn't get along without oil from them. And now it's going to be because of COVID, the shock of COVID and U.S. sanctions. This is a zombie idea, to quote what Paul Krugman calls these ideas that just continue to persist despite being proven wrong over and over and over again. It's a zombie idea because it appeals to what U.S. policymakers wish would happen. Juan Gonzalez, who is National Security Director for Latin America in the NSC staff, was interviewed recently. And he openly repudiated Obama's policy of engagement and endorsed the continuing sanctions to see what would happen, right? Which is to say, to see if they might finally succeed in bringing about regime change. So, well, what's the outlook then for the rest of the Biden administration? Well, obviously, it's pretty dismal. Both domestic political factors and foreign policy factors are really militating against engagement. Nobody in the White House is pushing for it, whereas there is some active resistance to returning to Obama's policy. Are there any rays of hope? Well, as I say, they keep promising that they're going to restore remittances and reopen the consular section, even though they haven't done it. As I mentioned, a number of people I know recently participated in a campaign of writing to the administration, writing to the president, to press him for specifically these two things, remittances and the consular section, which are the two things that would have the most important humanitarian benefits in Cuba. And they all got the same letter back, same form letter back, saying that the president was committed to restoring remittances, to finding a way, I think it's the framing, to restore remittances, and to reopening the consular section, flatly, to reopening the consular section, although no timeline given for that. So it seems to me, just from a kind of bureaucratic politics point of view, if they had really decided they weren't going to do these things after all, they would stop promising that they're going to do them, because it just makes them look foolish. And so, that's one possible ray of hope, that they will actually do these two minimal things. I would say they're also facing a lot of pressure on these two things, because they are quintessentially humanitarian issues.
As good as any.
How
are you?
So now, they're
Sorry, could I just interrupt? Yeah. So somebody got their mic on. Could you switch off your mic?
You're in Miami still?
There we go. I think that did it.
Try that, Bill.
Yeah, I think we're good. So as I say, these are really two quintessentially humanitarian issues. The lack of consular services is causing people to risk their lives to try to emigrate to the United States illegally. Whether it's crossing the Florida Strait, where we know a lot of people don't make it, or taking their chances with smugglers trying to come up through Mexico, only to get to the U.S. border and not be allowed in. It really is, I will say editorially, it's despicable that we don't have consular services and we continue to be in violation of our obligations under the 1994 Migration Agreement. But we may not see any action on these issues until after the midterm elections, for all the domestic political reasons that I outlined earlier. I think we may be in a situation analogous to 2010. 2010, there was a big effort in Congress, a big effort by outside lobbying groups in Congress to get Congress to repeal the ban on travel to Cuba. It failed. And part of the reason it failed was that congressional Democrats, led by Debbie Wasserman Schultz in particular, were afraid that it would hurt Democrats in Florida in the 2010 midterm elections. And so the Obama administration sat on its hands during that debate and did, basically that assured that it would fail. The midterms came, Democrats got, I forget Obama's exact word, shellacked or something like that. They lost terribly. They lost the House in 2010. And in January of 2011, Obama used his executive authority to restore people-to-people travel. It wouldn't surprise me to see a similar kind of situation unfold with Biden doing nothing between now and the midterm elections on either remittances or the embassy or travel, for that matter, but then actually taking some executive action once we get past the midterms, which the Democrats will probably going to lose again. So that's my analytic assessment, the best I can, of the method behind the madness of Biden's policy. But I want to close with an editorial reflection, if you don't mind. We should not forget that this is a policy of collective punishment that is deepening the suffering of millions of Cubans, literally millions of Cubans, every single day. It's a policy that no other country in the world supports, and it's a policy that for 60 years has failed to force Cuba to submit to the will of the United States. And so it's a policy that has really no practical or moral rationale whatsoever, and it ought to stop. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Bill. Can't really say that you've left us with very much to ask in some respects. It's so comprehensive. However, there are hands up. Let me see if I can see everyone. There's so many in the meeting. Gary has got his hand up. Gary, you may have to unmute.
Bill, I sense that there's being a rewrite among people in, Democrats in the Beltway, not you, but the people in the administration, about what happened when the opening occurred, in which there's this view that somehow the United States did not get what it expected and wanted out of the engagement, in spite of the 23 agreements and all of that. What's your reflection on that? And for example, Bill, do we have an obligation actually to do a better job maybe than we've done yet in producing good evidence about the opening and what was achieved? So at least that on record, we can be clear that the view that it didn't serve the interests of the United States and the Cuban people can be put to rest?
Yeah, absolutely. And we absolutely do. You're right. And this is, as a matter of fact, of course, this is a narrative that began with the Republicans who opposed Obama's opening in the first place, right? I mean, they constantly, from the moment from literally the 18th of December, the day after the announcement was actually the 17th of December, the day the announcement was made, Republicans were on the air saying, he didn't get anything. He didn't get anything for this. Well, that's obviously false in a whole variety of ways. And I know off the top of my head, I don't even know that I can list them all. There were so many. First of all, we got Alan Gross out of jail. That was significant for Alan Gross and his family. We won the release of 53 dissidents who were in prison, including all the remaining people from 2003. We got a commitment from the Cubans to expand internet access, which has probably had a bigger social and political impact than pretty much anything that's happened in the last decade or two. By restoring diplomatic relations, we were able to ultimately negotiate bilateral agreements in 23 different areas, every one of which serve the mutual interest of the two countries, ranging from counter-narcotics cooperation through environmental protection. The Cubans became more responsive to us on issues of returning non-political fugitives to Cuba. There's just a really, really wide range of issues on which the basic interests of the United States were well served. Now, what did not happen, and which I don't think Obama, in fact, I know Obama did not think would happen, is that the opening to Cuba did not suddenly create a transition to democracy in Cuba itself. Obama didn't expect that it would, but Obama's argument was that in the long term, if the United States took away the external boogeyman, if you will, the external threat, it would create an international environment that was more enabling for Cuba's internal political dynamics to unfold uninterrupted, if you will, by an external threat. And Obama was confident that plus engagement with the United States, commercial, cultural, educational, would help to shape the trajectory of the Cuban Revolution toward a more open economy and a more open society. It's a hypothesis, of course, but that was his, if you will, his long game, as they called it. But the idea that suddenly just engagement by itself was going to magically transform Cuba into a democracy, or magically make the Cuban government, more tolerant of U.S. financed internal dissidents, no sensible person ever really thought that. But the narrative that's been taken up by opponents of the policy is that, well, it didn't work. It didn't work because Cuba is still a communist system. And so obviously this was pointless. And the only way to deal with communists at the end of the day is to continue to punish them until they cease to exist.
Thanks, Bill. Helen, you had your hand up and were second, and you've suddenly become third. But if you want to ask your question first, if Lawrence doesn't mind, he has his hand up as well, but you go ahead.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Bill. I really always enjoy listening to you.
Thanks.
So I have a couple of questions. One links to this point, which I think obviously I entirely agree with you about the importance as a sort of political force, external factor behind the decision to move towards rapprochement was the pressure from the Latin American heads of states. And incredibly, among those that said we will not turn up to the next summit were, right-wing and centre-right governments. I'm just wondering, I mean, you mentioned the sort of possible potential return of a pink tide, but the other issue might be the export of Cuba's COVID-19 vaccines and sort of influence that this might have. I mean, on a practical level, it is likely to generate a demand from not just the WHO, the World Health Organization, but specifically from the United States administration or public health authorities or national regulatory body to recognize the COVID vaccines, because this is going to be a major issue. It's already a major issue for the Cuban population who want to travel to the United States and Spain, and their vaccines are not recognized. And that, will change gradually for some countries, but maybe not for the United States. It's a very big political decision. But having now almost fully vaccinated the Cuban population, these 120 million doses they're producing are going to be exported. So you'll also have populations, mainly but not entirely in the global south, who are vaccinated with the Cuban vaccine. And I don't know whether you've thought through how that might impact the question of external pressure to recognize the vaccines, which indirectly is, engaging and acknowledging the Cuban achievement. That was the first thing. And then the other thing is, I remember your very sort of clear explanation around, during the Trump administration about the importance that the role that was played by the accusation about what was first called sonic attacks and then microwave attacks and finally the Havana syndrome, and how what this did is created a feeling that when measures were introduced, like the was it November 2017, the list of restricted entities, that US businesses, even those who were engaging and were happy to be engaging with Cuba, didn't become a strong lobby and against that, because they didn't want to be seen to be sort of defending or supporting a government that was being accused of attacking US diplomats. Now the scenario in relation to that has changed, and you didn't mention, you know, the CIA report. So I know you obviously have views on that, and I would just be really interested to know what you think.
Sure. So let me start with the vaccines. I think this is a really good point that you've made. You know, the extent to which Cuba is able to provide vaccines at a reasonable price to a wide variety of countries, particularly again in Latin America, I think, could really make a difference in terms of their willingness to stand up to the United States when it comes to, first of all, U.S. policy itself, but also the inclusion of Cuba in international forums. So I think particularly now, if we do get you know, a progressive government in Colombia, a progressive government in Brazil, on top of the ones that we've already got, and you know, this it's another reason for them to follow what I think would be their instinct anyway, which is to push the United States on the issue of Cuba. It gives them a tangible, material reason to do it, as well as just their general sort of anti-imperialist instinct when it comes to the giant of the North. In terms of the U.S. recognition of the vaccine, I think that just depends on, frankly, the World Health Organization, right? If the Cubans can get their vaccine approved by the World Health Organization, I think it then almost automatically becomes recognized in the United States. Although I don't know the real details of that, but that's my impression. In terms of the sonic attacks, yeah, I mean, every time a new report comes out, it takes this argument in a completely different direction, right? So I have no idea what the hell happened. Really, I mean, truly, I have no idea what happened. Every time I get to a point where a particular argument or theory has convinced me, new evidence or new report comes out that I read and I say, well, yeah, that's pretty compelling. That other report must have been wrong. I don't know how many of you may have seen the 60 Minutes segment that was on the other day. The very first interview with a CIA officer from the embassy in Cuba, U.S. Embassy in Cuba, who was one of the very first people affected and very seriously disabled as a result. So they had an interview with him, which was fascinating. They had interviews with a number of other people who were suffering from this. And the whole frame of the 60 Minutes piece are under attack by some foreign adversary all around the world. That was the framing of it. Then at the very end, they interview the director of the CIA, Burns, and the CIA has just put out this report, which says, we have no evidence that our people are actually systematically under attack around the world by any foreign adversary. They have cases they can't explain. They still can't explain. But it was sort of what he said was just the opposite of the way that the issue had been framed, right? I think what's changed, though, is that it's hard to blame the Cubans anymore, right? Because these attacks have happened all around the world, including right here in Washington, D.C. And with the Cuban embassy now, you know, at minimal skeletal staff, I'm sure every one of them is trailed by 2 or 3 FBI agents everywhere they go every day. It's just no possibility that the Cubans are behind what happened here in Washington, D.C. So now the fallback position on the right is, okay, maybe the Cubans didn't do it, but they know who did it, because nothing happens in Cuba that the government doesn't know about, right? But also demonstrably false, and I could cite you half a dozen examples of bad things that happened to Cuba that the government, well, I'll cite you one, or maybe 2. The Cuban government didn't know about the Ministry of the Interior Special Operations Unit that was smuggling cocaine into the United States until we told them about it. That was the General Ochoa scandal in 1989. We arrested the distributors on our end. They ratted out their Cuban connection. We then told the Cubans about it. The Cubans started an investigation and arrested everybody. That was number one. And that had been going on for over a year. The other were the hotel bombings in the late 1990s by Luis Posada Carriles. That went on for 6 months to a year, and the Cubans could not figure out who did it or who was behind it. And to the point where we were sharing intelligence with them about what we could figure out about it. I don't know that our intelligence was decisive in that, but it took them 6 months to a year to actually catch the people who were doing it, who were not particularly sophisticated people, frankly. They were Salvadoran mercenaries who had been hired by Posada Carriles to carry bombs into the country and set them off. So it's clearly not the case that, you know, Cuban security is all seeing and all knowing. But, you know, that's just, you know, one more bit of disinformation coming out of Miami. Oh, U.S. business backtracking. Sorry. Yeah. So there's a couple of reasons that U.S. business was not an effective lobby to keep Trump from rolling back sanctions. One is that although there was enormous interest, and you know, a new trade delegation went to Cuba like every week from December 1914 through the end of the administration. They found out pretty quickly Cuba's not an easy place to do business. And so a lot of them basically said, we'll wait a little while till the Cuban bureaucracy becomes less sclerotic and the Cuban market becomes a little bigger and more profitable. And we'll sort of wait and see. Now there's about 3 to 4 dozen companies that signed contracts almost entirely in there's travel, airlines, cruise ships, and so on, telecommunications, so that our cell phones can work in Cuba now, and a handful of other things. So it was a narrow slice, if you will, of U.S. business that really got involved and was really committed. Agriculture, too, of course. So that was part of the problem. There wasn't a broad enough engagement to the business community yet with actual skin in the game, right, or chips on the table, whatever metaphor you prefer, that they stood to lose when sanctions were imposed. The other thing is that, you know, the business community, they follow the election returns, and Trump comes in and declares Cuba as an enemy again and puts all these sanctions back on. If you're a business executive trying to make a decision about whether to invest in Cuba, you're weighing the political risk. Well, the political risk just went way up as a result of that, right? Then you get Title III from Helms-Burton, and, you know, the general attitude in the business community is to just sort of stand aside rather than pound your head against a brick wall and wait for a new policy. And the other thing, and I'll stop with this because I'm talking too much, is that I forgot what it was. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. But there was another reason that I had on the tip of my tongue for why business people might not want to jump into Cuba right now.
Stay on your feet, Bill. Lawrence, you're next. Lawrence,
thanks so much, as always, Bill. It's very clearly laid out and very informative, and an excellent presentation.
Thanks. Nice to see you.
Hand, I don't know that you really did sustain your argument that there was no method to what Biden was doing. I think, in a way, what emerged was a clear explanation of the pressures he was under, and then the results are more or less determined by that. And there are two aspects of that I'd like you to say just a little bit more of. One concerns the change in the electoral attitude in Miami, because after all, 2010 was one thing, but by 2014, the Democrats were doing better in Miami, and even the younger generation of Cuban Americans were thinking, well, you know, there's our relatives and we know what it's like there and we want to ease conditions because, you know, we're not dreaming of going back to 1960. That's not the cohort that we are. And yet the current generation, it said, people in Miami say, the current cohort is more, and you yourself said, maybe as much as 70% of Cuban Americans voted for Republicans. And so there's been a big shift, and it's not really so much a revival of the very old anti-Cubans, it's a change in the mood of the newer ones, and not only of Cubans, but of the Latin American community more generally at least I'd like you to say about that. And that's connected with, I think the clue to that is not just within Florida, I think that's connected with Venezuela. And so the foreign policy feature was, in 2016, it wasn't so unreasonable to think, well, if we're nice to Cuba, Cuba will be reasonably bearable with us and will help the peace process in Colombia and so on and so forth. By 2020, whether fairly or unfairly, and I know you'll say unfairly, I mean, I presume you'll say unfairly, but anyway, the Cubans had allowed themselves to be recast as, you know, the last Praetorian Guard propping up the utterly contemptible and indefensible Maduro regime. And that meant that all kinds of people who might have defended Cuba or advocated your kind of position in 2016 felt that the ground had been cut from underneath them in the US, not only in the US, but also in Europe. So Biden, in those circumstances, is just doing what any politician will do, isn't he?
Well, Biden certainly is a politician. I think you're right about Venezuela. I think the Venezuela factor here is important in a number of ways. But let me start with, you know, what happened in the Cuban American community. I mean, you know, we've got now 30 years of polling data from Florida International University among Cuban Americans in South Florida. And the long-term secular trend was toward more moderation in the community, right? I mean, all the questions they asked, what about the embargo? You know, do you support the embargo? Do you support diplomatic relations? Do you support travel? Do you support sale of food and medicine? All those questions. All the downward trend, or the trend toward a more moderate policy, a less hardline policy, was absolutely uninterrupted for almost 30 years. And then suddenly it reversed, and by large number, well, by substantial numbers, it reversed. It began to reverse. So what happened exactly? So I think there's a number of hypotheses. So let me share some of them. One is Venezuela. That Venezuela and the influx of Venezuelan exiles into Miami re-energized the hardliners in the Cuban American community, but also sort of, if you will, reminded other Cuban Americans of the evils of communism and the way it destroyed people's lives historically in Cuba. It just refreshed all of those memories and all of that real emotion in the Cuban American community. Another factor is social media. You really can't underestimate the impact, or can't overestimate the impact of social media in this community, and the social media influencers like Otaola just constantly bombarding younger Cuban Americans with misinformation, with disinformation, and animosity toward Cuba. And in terms of voting, there, I think what happened, anyway, so before I get off of the polling data, so the result of that was you saw a shift in the polling data of about between 10 and 15 points in the polling data on attitudes toward things like the embargo in the Cuban American community, right? So it went from being at the very best moment, like 50 6% of Cuban Americans in favor of ending the embargo to, I think in the last Florida International poll, it was like 54% in favor of keeping the embargo, right? You actually fascinatingly see a similar shift in the Gallup poll, which is a strictly emotional poll. It is, do you see Cuba favorably or unfavorably, right? It's a national survey. And you see the same shift. When Obama opens relations with Cuba, it goes from about 45% positive to 55% positive. When Trump comes in and declares Cuba our enemy again, it reverses right back. So the general population obviously doesn't give a damn about Cuba and isn't following what's going on. They're just taking cues from their president. Cuban Americans are not immune to that. They're taking cues too, right? And, they might prefer a president who says Cuba's the enemy. It might appeal to, deeper attitudes. But, if it looks like things are moving in a positive U.S.-Cuba relations direction, they adapt. Cuban Americans adapt to that just like other people do. So that's one thing. In terms of the voting, obviously the attitudinal difference made an impact on the vote. But it's certainly in 2020, the presidential vote in 2020. But it wasn't the only thing by a long shot. First of all, the Republicans have an extremely well-developed ground game party apparatus in South Florida among Cuban Americans. They've been building it for years. Guillermo Grenier has done a really good article about this, about that history of organizing by the Republicans among Cuban Americans and how Democrats ignored them in the early years, which is published on the AU Center for Latin American and Latino Studies website in a symposium that we released a little while ago. If you haven't read that article, really important for understanding the long-term development of Republican hegemony among Cuban Americans. Second thing is that the Republican Party didn't run in 2020 against Obama's Cuba policy. They ran against Democrats who are all socialists, right? That was the argument, right? Democrats, and they point to Bernie Sanders, who came in second, right? And they say he's a self-declared socialist. And they ran that old video of him saying nice things about Cuba after he, did a visit there 20 or 30 years ago. And so the message was, if Democrats win the election, they will destroy the American economy by pursuing socialism in the same way that the economy in your home country was destroyed by communists, and that's why you came here. And now they're going to destroy the economy here. And they scared the crap out of people, right? And I think it was more recent arrivals who were in some ways more vulnerable to that disinformation because they had just left. And so the memories of the economic hardships on the island were fresh in mind for them. And finally, the Democrats, the Biden campaign didn't devote any resources to Florida. They didn't have a state director, believe it or not, didn't have a state director in Florida until September of the election year. The people on the ground in Florida were begging them to pay attention, to send resources, to send their people, to bring Biden down, to bring Vice President Harris down. And the campaign wouldn't do it. Now, I will say in defense of the campaign, Biden didn't look very good early in the primaries. He didn't get a lot of money. He was short on resources. They devoted the resources they had into rebuilding the blue wall in Michigan and Illinois and Pennsylvania. And at the end of the day, it turns out that was the right strategy because he didn't win those states by very much, right? So in retrospect, it's sort of hard to say, well, you should have put more money into Florida where he lost by, I forget how much, but by an enormous amount. So from a strategic approach to resource allocation in a campaign, they made the right decision. The result is that they got wiped out in Florida. You
were going to say something about Venezuela, Bill, or?
Oh, yes. Well, as I say, I think I think that Venezuela has been important because it's another fresh anti-communist constituency in South Florida. As I say, I think it's reinforced and energized the more hardline elements in the Cuban American community and sort of revived that activism in that community, which had been really subdued during the Obama years, right? I mean, they felt like they'd lost, right? It looked like we were moving towards complete normalization of relations. It looked like they were defeated. Trump comes in and says, no, Cuba's the enemy after all, and they're all re-energized. And I think that, you know, the Venezuelan immigrant population helped to do that. And it did give a foreign policy argument, right? Oh, look, Cuba really is still a bad guy in the hemisphere.
Great. Right. Next up, we've got two more people waiting, Bill. Got a few more minutes yet. Al Campbell.
Yeah. Hey, Bill. Great talk. I'll throw that in at the beginning. So I had two quick statements, comments, and they lead me to a question. And the first one relates to Gary's opening suggestion that we step up our research and get information out. And I think that's really important. I mean, you said it was important, and you know, you and Helen, for example, are doing a hell of a lot of that. But I think we should just keep in mind that there are a lot of people that have already done a lot of research. There's a lot of material out there, and obviously the U.S. media chooses not to propagate that. And so, you know, we can win some people in the margin, on the margin, but there's a hell of a lot of people that no amount of information is going to change their mind from where they're at right now. So, I mean, it's good, we should do it, but it's not much of a panacea to get us out of the mess that we're in. Just my comment on that. The other thing is that the question is always, you know, as you pose it, what's there to win for a president and an administration and a party for reversing policy, for doing what Obama did and everything? And, you know, I think very much the big thing for Obama wasn't super committed to it as a principle. I mean, was the Latin American pressure. I think the Latin American pressure was, you know, there were some other issues too, but that was the really, that was a big thing. It was a really big thing at that point. And, you know, as we've said, the pink tide isn't there right now. And, you know, what Helen brought up is really important, what the COVID stuff could do. But they can probably get access to the COVID stuff without having to take the steps that they did as far as putting pressure on Obama and everything. So the question is, what is there to win? And that goes for both the Democrats and the Republicans reversing it, because there's a very good chance the Republicans will be back in office in 2024. And so, you know, the question is, what would be the motivation for we'd like them to reverse too. Nixon reversed on China, so, you know, we can always hope. So, so what would be, and that takes me to my question, which is actually, Lawrence brought it up, but I want to re-ask it and just go a little bit with it. And I was going to ask about the Cuban Americans, because, you know, all the figures you gave on this reversal, which is real sharp and everything, they're all aggregate figures. And I'm wondering if we divide that up a little bit into the older ones, the ones that have been here a long, long time, the ones that have been here 20 or 30 years, and then the really young ones. Because part of that dialogue for the reversal in 2016 was that the young Cuban Americans that had grown up here were no longer as interested in that issue. I mean, they wanted to improve relations so they could go back and visit relatives back there. And part of it was they were really interested in what was happening to them in the United States. They were beginning to turn Democratic because, like a lot of people, they were having a lot of difficulties after the Great Recession in the United States. And so that's my question. I'm throwing it out. Obviously, it's highly speculative, but the big thing that either administration could win is actually the state of Florida. I mean, if this change really took place among a re-energized, the old timers aren't going to change at all, but the middle layer, the 20 and 30-year people that have been here, they've become re-energized on becoming anti-communist and stuff like that. But my question is whether the young people, the young Cuban Americans, are buying into that at all. Because if not, that still opens up an obvious road that, of course, it's going to be 5 years, 7 years from now. It's not going to happen right away. But that's a way that could have a really change for a really big win, because the big thing, which would be even bigger than the Latin American pressure, would be winning the state of Florida. That they could actually have progressive policies that would carry Florida. So that's my question about that. What do you think is especially about in this whole change? How much do you have any feel for how really young Cuban Americans bought into this change, which has occurred since 2016?
So I mean, your theory is exactly what Obama did in the 2008 and 2012 campaigns, right? Is he looked at the Cuban American community and he said, we can see this long-term secular trend towards more moderation. I'm going to appeal to younger, moderate Cuban Americans who want a better state-to-state relationship so that they can stay connected with their families and travel back and forth without a problem. And it worked. He did really well he got 35% of the Cuban American vote in 2008, more than anybody but Clinton, who also got 35% in his second election. And then in Obama's second election, 2012, he got 50% of the Cuban American vote. So it looked like Democrats were really right on the eve of a breakthrough in the Cuban American vote. The problem is, it is that younger cohort that has shifted to the right. And as I say, there's a number of hypotheses about it. Nobody's really been able to, say definitively, here's what the reason for it is. But that's the huge dilemma that Democrats face, because it's exactly those younger people who are, in effect, the future, political future of the Cuban American community, and they've been the ones most seduced by the disinformation. And I really do think social media is a critical component of it. In terms of what do the two sides have to gain? Well, this is the fundamental problem, isn't it? I have a very good friend who doesn't study Cuba. He's a Latin Americanist, but has never studied Cuba. But worked in American politics for a while. And whenever I talk to him about Cuba, he says, they're not going to do anything. Right? So they're not going to do anything. And I said, well, they're this and this. And he said, no, there's nothing for them to gain with Cuba.
Yeah,
they're not going to do anything.
That's the issue. Yeah.
And so far, he's been right so far.
Yeah, thanks.
We had one other question, but I think Jocelyn, she's left. Bill, can I ask you one question at the end? And we've been on this for a half an hour now. Nobody's asked the big elephant in the room question, and that is, the new crisis over Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that Russia is Cuba's biggest ally, or second biggest ally, if you like, and Venezuela's just said they fully support the Russian move. And I mean, how is that going to affect the equation, do you think?
Well, not positively, that's for sure. The Cuban, I don't know if you've had a chance, the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Relations came out with a statement, I think just this morning, which is worth taking a look at if you're interested. It's in both Spanish and English on their website. It really threads a needle very interestingly. On the one hand, it says, NATO has been threatening Russia. Russia has a right to defend its vital interests, but it conspicuously does not say anything in support of the incursion, and it does not even mention the breakaway states, let alone actually recognize them. So the Cubans are being cautious on this, I think, to minimize the political damage that accrues to them, while at the same time, defending, in a sense, Russia, because it is still an important ally. And with a hostile United States, Russia is an even more important ally to the Cubans, right? They have to have a counterweight to the United States. It will, of course, be used by opponents of engagement as yet one more reason to regard Cuba as an enemy and therefore someone we should not engage with.
Right. Okay. Well, you don't think it could have the opposite effect of kind of like saying, well, let's try and get Cuba on side, to prevent, for example, Russia putting maybe some kind of offensive what would be regarded as offensive weapons in Cuba. I mean, a rerun of 62 or something.
Well, you know, when the Russian deputy foreign minister sort of made this vague suggestion that, you know, perhaps Russia ought to build up its military infrastructure in Cuba and Venezuela, the response from the Biden administration was essentially, well, we would respond really strongly to that. They better not do that. I just totally missing the irony of saying Russia can't be in our sphere of influence while we're expanding into Russia's. No, there's just no self-awareness whatsoever in that regard. You know, I don't know that Russia really wants to do that, frankly, or that Cuba would see a great deal of benefit in it. There is no military assistance Russia could give Cuba that would defend it, really, at the end of the day, from a U.S. intervention. And the Cubans are well aware of the fact that, I mean, Raul Castro had said at one point, you know, the way to defeat U.S. intervention is to prevent it from happening, because you can't defeat it, right? So no. Now there is, I mean, fascinatingly, at the Pentagon, there is a real concern about competing with Russia and China and Iran, of all people, in influence in the Western Hemisphere. China is probably at the top of the list just because of the expansion of trade relations, where, you know, China does more trade with Brazil and Chile than we do now. But it hasn't penetrated, I don't think, into you know, the decision-making circles, right? It's just, look, I mean, ironically, it's the Pentagon who probably has the best bilateral relations with Cuba of any section of the United States government because of their cooperation around migration and narcotics trafficking and counterterrorism.
Great. Well, all I can say, Bill, is a really big thanks to you for what has been a tremendous tour de force. As ever, you're getting applause there from
I see that. Yes, thank you.
and certainly, I'm sure everybody is echoing those actions. Yeah, Helen's clapping as well. So, unless you have anything that you feel you missed out and you would want to add, all I can say is thanks again. And for everybody who's here, this has been recorded. I will be placing it on our YouTube site, and I will write to you all with the link afterwards. The next seminar is on March the 10th at the same time, 5 p.m. GMT, when Professor John Kirk from Dalhousie University, Nova Scotia, will be talking about Cuban medical internationalism. And of course, I'm sure he'll be talking about the COVID vaccines. And maybe by then we'll have some updates on how that effect is, the effect they are having in Latin America. So again, I will put a notice of that session into the link that into the email with the link that I'll send you afterwards. So thanks again, everybody, for coming, and we're really grateful to your support, and again to you, Bill, for your time.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for tuning in, and be sure to thanks of course to Stephen for organizing it, but be sure to tune in for John Kirk, who may be the world's best expert on Cuban medical internationalism.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.